Not I, but Christ, written by Mehdi Khani. There are certain lives which, when first recounted to us, appear almost too symmetrical to be believed. The persecutor becomes the preacher. The accuser becomes the advocate. The enemy kneels and rises a friend. Such transformations, told in brief, possess the charm of a parable and the simplicity of a moral tale fit for the instruction of youth. Yet the life of Paul the Apostle, if examined not from a distance but from within, resists so tidy a summary. He was a man of discipline and education, firm in conviction and certain of his cause. He believed himself to stand in defense of the honor of God. His convictions were sharpened by study and reinforced by praise. In time, they hardened into an unmatched self-righteous zeal. If he erred with sincerity. If he acted with violence, he did so under the persuasion that righteousness demanded it. It is this, perhaps, that renders his story so disquieting. For what occurred upon the road to Damascus was a collapse. A man accustomed to leading was struck down. A man who believed himself to see clearly was rendered blind. A voice addressed him by name, and in that address exposed a blindness older than the dust upon the road. The light revealed that the God he believed he defended did not require his violence. It revealed that zeal, when severed from mercy, becomes cruelty clothed in Scripture. It revealed that the men and women he had bound in chains were servants of the very Lord he claimed to serve. And most of all, it revealed that he himself had been blind for years. What follows in these pages is an imagined confession. It invites the reader to sit beside Paul in the narrow confines of his imprisonment and listen as he looks back upon the man he once was and the mercy that undid him. We are accustomed, in speaking of being born again, to imagine warmth, assurance, and triumphant clarity. Yet Paul's rebirth began in darkness. It began with disorientation and the humiliation of being led by the hand. Nothing was added to him in that first hour. Everything was taken away. The identity he had constructed, the righteousness in which he had taken pride, the confidence with which he had judged others, these were stripped from him with a swiftness that left him simply a man confronted with truth. There is something unsettling in this, for it suggests that conviction alone is no safeguard against error, that zeal may coexist with blindness, that a man may act in what he believes to be loyalty to God while standing in opposition to the very heart of divine mercy. Such reflections are not confined to the first century. To many, Paul stands as a figure carved in marble and lifted to an unimaginable height. In this narrative, he stands as a mirror in which the reader may discern uncomfortable resemblances. The pride of certainty, the readiness to divide the world into the righteous and the condemned, and the satisfaction of believing oneself chosen to defend truth, may all be called perennial temptations. Yet this is not a tale of despair, for if Paul's former self is recognizable, so too is the grace that met him. The man who once guarded cloaks while stones were lifted in judgment would, in time, speak of mercy with a tenderness born of experience rather than theory. The persecutor would learn to pray for his accusers. The defender of the law would come to understand righteousness as gift. He would write, in later years, that he had been crucified with Christ, and that it was no longer he who lived. Such words are the testimony of a man who experienced the death of his former certainty and the strange liberty that followed it. If this book accomplishes anything, it will do so through a voice shaped by suffering and reflection. It asks for attention to the passage from darkness into light and to the long, humbling ground between them. The road to Damascus lies behind Paul as he writes. The chains at his wrists are real. The sword that awaits him is no rumor. In the midst of those narrowing circumstances, a quiet freedom remains beyond the reach of empire. From that freedom, this confession proceeds. May the reader enter it both as a spectator of another man's transformation and as one willing, however reluctantly, to consider his own. Chapter 1. Chains of Memory. There are hours in a man's life when he finds himself in the most unwelcome of companies, that of his own recollections. In such hours, when there is neither diversion nor disguise to soften their approach, they descend upon him in a familiarity at once intimate and merciless. I have learned in this narrow Roman cell that solitude invites the most insistent of guests. It is said that a man left alone with time comes face to face with himself. I have come to suspect he meets a procession of selves, each more accusing than the last. The youth, fierce and unyielding. The officer of zeal, armed with conviction as with a sword. And now this other creature, seated upon a cold floor, wrists encircled by iron, listening for the approach of memories that never tire. The cell in which I am kept appears less constructed than unearthed, the ground itself having yielded in reluctance to admit men such as I. The walls never dry, and the air carries a weight that presses upon the chest. Small animals dart about their dominion. The chains at my wrists speak in low metallic murmurs whenever I move, bearing the sound of a long and thankless duty. None of these discomforts, which would once have seemed intolerable to me, possess the sharpness of that which visits without sound or warning. I see him, Stephen. He appears to me as one remembers a scene burned upon the mind with a heat no passing of years can cool. He was upon his knees, and he did not seem to kneel. His face was lifted upward, away from us who stood about him with tightened jaws and hardened hearts, and toward some region beyond our sight. There was in his expression a tranquility so misplaced in that dreadful circle that it has haunted me ever since. I remember the stones. They were of a pleasing smoothness, gathered from the ground without effort. They felt familiar in my grasp. I remember the ease of bearing such weight, the swiftness of the mind in persuading itself that judgment may be grasped and cast like any common stone. I did not cast them. I stood apart, collecting the cloaks of the men who did. My approval burned with a zeal more violent than any arm could express. My heart at that time was a thing of flint. I felt a pride so fierce that it seemed to warm my blood. I believed myself to be an instrument of righteousness. I believed I saw with clear sight. It is a dreadful thing to discover, long after, that one's clearest sight was in fact the deepest blindness. The sound returns to me often, the terrible, intimate sound of stone striking flesh, the interruption of breath, the murmurs of prayer where curses should have risen. For he prayed. He prayed for us. He prayed for me, for Saul. If there is a single moment that divides what I was from what I became, it rests upon the road to Damascus. I remember it plainly. The sun stood overhead. I rode with letters in my possession and with a clear purpose before me. My zeal left no room for doubt. I went forth with certainty, believing myself chosen to defend the honor of God. Then came the light. It bore no resemblance to the familiar light of day. This brightness pierced from within and laid bare not the road before me, but the man who walked upon it. I fell. I remember the dust, the confusion, and then the voice. "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" "Who are you, Lord?" "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." In that instant, my sight departed from me. As the darkness closed in, I began to perceive, dimly at first, that nothing had been taken which had not already been lacking. The blindness had not begun then. It had long been my companion. The light had merely revealed it. Here, in this prison of stone and iron, I have often reflected that it was not the light that blinded me, but the life I had lived before it. The truth, once seen, was too fierce for the eyes that had long refused to see. I am now a prisoner of Rome. This fact is made known to me by the weight at my wrists and the narrowness of my surroundings. Yet there is within me a liberty no empire can confiscate. I had expected it to come through victory. Instead, it came when I broke. The fall was the beginning of something new. The nights are long here. Sleep seldom visits me, and when it does, it is light and uncertain. In the quiet hours, I feel my end approaching. Still, it carries no terror. It feels instead like something long prepared. My life, with all its errors and mercies, gathers itself toward its appointed conclusion. Before that conclusion arrives, I must speak. I owe no defense for the man I was. I speak so that another, hearing my confession, may recognize the same certainty in themselves and tremble before the light confronts them. If by recounting the darkness in which I walked, I may persuade even one man to lay down the stones already warming in his hands, then these chains will have served a purpose beyond their design. And so I sit, in the damp breath of Roman stone, attended by memories more faithful than any guard, and begin to arrange the fragments of my life into a tale that may, for someone, become sight. Chapter 2. The Righteous Fire. There are memories which present themselves with such persistence that a man begins to suspect they possess a life independent of his own. Of all such recollections that attend me in this damp and cheerless habitation, none is so resolute as that of the light. It rises before the rest, claiming the privilege of standing first in the procession of my past. It arrived so forcefully that it stilled the world around me. The brightness entered without warmth and without mercy. It laid hold of me. Certainty fell. Pride stood exposed. Even now, with years laid upon me like heavy cloaks, and my joints protesting the passage of time, I feel that brightness pressing behind my eyes. Without diminishing or softening, it has awaited me with a patience that is terrible and exacting. Even so, to begin there would be to begin at the end of a story whose earlier chapters must be understood if the conclusion is to carry its proper weight. I was born, as I then believed, with no small satisfaction, into order, into discipline, into expectation. My first home was Tarsus, a city of lively commerce and sharper intellect, where Roman pride strode beside the refinements of Greek thought. But my affections, even in youth, were not content to remain amidst such variety. They leaned with increasing insistence toward Jerusalem and toward the law, which promised a structure so complete that no confusion could survive within it. I remember the rooms of my father's house filled with the low murmur of discourse. Scribes and elders, seated with scrolls unrolled before them, engaged in debates whose depth I did not grasp at first. Nonetheless, their gravity impressed itself upon me. I listened as a child listens in wonder, and committed it to memory as a soldier prepares for battle. By the time I could form my letters upon a tablet, I could recite passages from the Shema and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah without faltering. My tutors praised my aptitude. My father declared me marked for something greater. And so I was sent to Jerusalem while still a boy, and once there, I never looked back. At the feet of Gamaliel, my mind was sharpened. Under his instruction, I learned the law thoroughly, and I learned how to use it. I was exact. I was tireless. I was possessed by a hunger that I would have denied was for power, but which I admitted was for order. The law stood in my mind as a stronghold, a defense against what I believed to be the world's steady decay. When I walked through the courts of the temple, robed in the dignity of my training, I knew who I was. I was Saul of Tarsus, son of a faithful house, defender of the covenant, and, as I imagined, an instrument well fitted to preserve the purity of Israel. My hands were clean. My conscience, so I believed, shone like polished brass. Even in those days, there were moments when something unsettled the alignment of my thoughts. A curious brightness would seem to pass across the inner eye, a hesitation in my otherwise unbroken certainty. I attributed it to fatigue, or to some passing fancy unworthy of attention. Now I know that the light had begun its quiet work long before I acknowledged its presence. It was during this period that the temple began to stir with persistent rumors of a man from Nazareth. A teacher, some said, a healer, according to others. To many of us, he was nothing less than a threat. It was whispered that he ate with sinners, that he showed little regard for the sanctity of the Sabbath, that he dared to speak of himself in terms that bordered upon blasphemy. Such reports stirred in me a fiercer heat, which I mistook for holiness, a zeal that persuaded me righteousness could be secured through action. They crucified him. Instead of silencing his influence, his followers multiplied. They gathered in houses and markets, speaking of resurrection, calling themselves followers of the way. To me, they appeared as a contagion spreading at the heart of our people. I set myself upon the task of becoming the remedy. I argued with them in synagogues, exposing what I believed to be their errors with the sharpness of my training. When words proved insufficient, I turned without hesitation to sterner measures. I entered homes. I dragged men and women into the streets. I witnessed their tears and their protests, and felt within myself no softening, only an increasing conviction that I was acting in obedience to God. There were nights, after such exertions, when I lay awake with a strange fire running through my veins. I told myself that this fervor was the mark of devotion, that such restlessness was evidence of my love for the law. In those same hours, the brightness would return. It was nearer than any dream or vision, and more difficult to dismiss. I would rise and walk the length of the room, convincing myself that conviction was enough. The light did not contend with me. It remained. It waited for Damascus, that journey which was to be the crowning act of my zeal. Letters from the high priest rested in my possession. Authority and purpose traveled with me, steadfast as the companions at my side. I would strike at this growing heresy in its own refuge and return to Jerusalem vindicated. The road stretched before us beneath an unbroken sky. Dust rose under the hooves of our beasts. The sun stood high and relentless, but my thoughts were fixed on what lay ahead. As we advanced, a quiet unease began to stir within me. I had faced anger and accusation without trembling, so I did not mistake the sensation for fear. It was quieter than that, though more disquieting. A stillness gathered about the world, the air holding its breath for something not yet revealed. I did not speak of it. I would not have admitted it even to myself. But I felt it, as one feels the pressure before a storm, or the quiet that precedes a final breath. I told myself it was fatigue, or the weight of responsibility. I reasoned with it as I would have reasoned with any troublesome thought. Behind my careful logic, there remained a whisper I could not silence. You will not return from this road as the man who left. Still, I pressed on. Each step brought us nearer to Damascus, and nearer, though I did not know it, to the unmaking of Saul. For I was riding toward a confrontation with a light that would not be ignored, a fire that would not be quenched, and a voice that would shatter every certainty upon which I had built my life. Chapter 3. The Enemy Within. There are seasons in a man's life when he is applauded for the very qualities that will, in time, condemn him. I passed through such a season so confident that I mistook the praise of others for the approval of heaven itself. They called my conduct holy. They named it justice. They pointed to me as an example of faithfulness, and I, being eager to believe what was so generously spoken, accepted their verdict without hesitation. In the council chambers, beneath the gaze of elders whose long beards lent gravity to every nod and murmur, I spoke in tones that allowed no room for doubt. Scrolls, sealed by the ring of the high priest, were placed into my hands amid expressions of trust and satisfaction. In those moments, I felt less a man than an instrument. I was, as I believed then, the law's sword, its necessary severity, and I bore it with an eagerness that shamed no part of me. When I looked upon the followers of the way, I saw a contagion, something spreading through our people that required decisive remedy. I pursued them as one would pursue vermin in a granary, convinced that the health of the whole depended upon their removal. I entered homes in the dark hours before dawn. I broke doors from their hinges. I dragged fathers into the streets while their children clung to their garments. I separated mothers from sons, husbands from wives. Some pleaded with tears. Some resisted with anger. Some, to my great disquiet, received my intrusion with a composure so strange that it unsettled me far more than cries or curses ever could. They smiled, and their calm assurance unsettled me more than mockery or defiance would have done. I remember even now the peculiar discomfort it stirred within me. They seemed to possess a knowledge beyond my reach, one they felt no obligation to share. I dismissed it as folly. I told myself their tranquility sprang from delusion. I persuaded myself that shedding their blood would defend the name of God. Each time I repeated these arguments within my own mind, the fire of my zeal burned the hotter. I fed it with passages from the Scriptures. I recited the Shema before issuing commands. I kissed the scrolls that authorized my actions, treating the parchment as the source of sanctity for what I was about to do. There was, in those days, no room within me for doubt. Doubt, I believed, was a contagion that weakened the spirit, and I, in my own estimation, had become the physician appointed to remove such weakness wherever it appeared. Still, in the height of my fervor, something began to shift within me. It was a peculiar silence that seemed to accompany me wherever I went. I first became aware of it after the death of Stephen. In the nights that followed, I would wake abruptly. Sweat clung to my skin. The darkness of the room pressed in with intolerable weight. I attempted to pray, as I had always done, but the words, though familiar upon my tongue, fell from me across a great chasm. They no longer returned with the assurance I had known. I rebuked myself for such weakness. I refused to examine the matter further. Meanwhile, the followers of the Nazarene grew bolder. They spoke in synagogues. They proclaimed, in astonishing confidence, the resurrection of the man who was crucified. Reports reached us of healings, of visions, of men and women submitting themselves to this new allegiance in numbers that alarmed the authorities and stirred my zeal. I responded, as I knew how, with force. In Jerusalem, my presence became a threat that moved through narrow streets and darkened alleys. My name, I was told, passed from mouth to mouth in fearful whispers. I took this as evidence of success. I did not then understand that fear is a poor instrument for silencing what men believe to be true. It may drive them from one place, but it cannot drive the conviction from their hearts. They began to scatter. Some fled into Judea, others into Samaria and beyond. As they spread, so did the reach of my pursuit. It was then that I requested the letters. Documents bearing the seal of the high priest, granting me authority to pursue and seize any follower of Jesus in Damascus. I remember the sensation of those scrolls in my hands. Their weight felt significant, reassuring, almost sacred. I regarded them as tangible proof that my course was endorsed by the highest powers of our order. I assembled men to accompany me. We prepared the animals for the journey. I spoke of what we would accomplish. I described our arrival in Damascus as a cleansing storm that would leave the city purged of error. I rehearsed in my mind the words I would speak, the actions I would take. I fortified my heart against any hint of hesitation. For all this ordered exterior, something within me continued its quiet alteration. It had not yet taken a form I could recognize. I could not have named it if pressed. It stirred like a hidden current in still water. The road remains clear in my memory. Long and level, dust rose at every step we took. The sky stretched above us, heavy and silent, a vault of brass. And within my chest there was a weight that could not be dismissed by reason alone. I asked myself whether it was simple fatigue, whether the exertions of recent weeks had left me more weary than I cared to admit. But the sensation did not resemble weariness. It was deeper, more pervasive. It seemed to settle into the very marrow of my being. Each step forward felt like the beating of a hidden drum whose purpose remained beyond my understanding. My companions saw only my determination. They could not perceive the tension coiling within me. It began to dawn upon me, though I resisted the thought with all my accustomed discipline, that instead of riding toward the judgment of others, I was nearing a reckoning of my own. Still, I pressed on. There is, I have since learned, a peculiar kind of blindness that overtakes a man just before his fall. It arises from an excess of light that dazzles and leaves nothing seen. In that brightness, he sees nothing clearly, though he is convinced he sees everything. And so I rode on toward Damascus, armed with authority, accompanied by companions, and utterly unprepared for the moment when all my certainties would be stripped from me as dust shaken from a garment. Chapter 4. The Blood of Stephen. There are days in a man's life which seem unremarkable as they pass, and only later rise before him in such sharp relief that he questions how he once judged them ordinary. The day Stephen died was to my eyes then such a day as many others. To my memory now, it stands apart like a wound that never wholly closed. I remember first the dry heat. It pressed over Jerusalem, catching in the throat. The sky was of that hard and pitiless blue which admits no cloud and offers no relief. The streets bustled as they always did when pilgrims and traders filled the city, each intent upon his own affairs, as though the business of life could proceed undisturbed by the business of death. A man was about to die. I stood upon the outer edge of the gathering crowd, my arms folded in a composure I deemed proper to the occasion. Before us, in the dust, knelt Stephen. His posture showed no fear and carried no trace of defiance. His face was turned upward, and his lips moved with a deliberation that told of prayer rather than vengeance. I had seen his kind before, or believed I had. Men intoxicated with strange doctrines, speaking of a kingdom not of this world, daring to imply that the temple was but stone, and that the law found its fulfillment in the person of the crucified Nazarene. Such men, I told myself, must be silenced. The council had heard him at length. I remember the murmur that passed through the chamber as he wove together the histories of Moses and Abraham and the prophets with a skill that was, I must now admit, formidable. But to my ears then, his words were not admirable, but dangerous. When he spoke of seeing the heavens opened and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God, the conclusion, in our minds, was immediate. The judgment came at once and did not trouble me. There were no elaborate formalities, no extended deliberations. Stones were at hand, and hands were eager to use them. I found myself entrusted with the cloaks of the men who stepped forward to cast them. They stripped off their garments and placed them in my keeping, setting them aside as one does before heavy work. I accepted them readily. Indeed, I remember thinking that in doing so, I was contributing no less to the execution than they, for I enabled them to strike without hindrance. The first stone struck Stephen upon the shoulder. I saw his body recoil with the involuntary jerk of flesh beneath sudden pain. Another followed, and another. One caught him upon the ribs, driving the breath from him in a visible shudder. Dust rose from the ground in a choking cloud as the stones descended, and through it all he did not cry out. He looked through the dust, his gaze fixed beyond it, as if the scene unfolding about him had already lost its hold upon his attention. There was in his expression something I could not understand. It was beyond despair and bore no trace of pleading. What I saw instead was a composure so ill-suited to the circumstances that it irritated me beyond measure. I remember thinking, in a heat equal to that of the day, how I disliked his face. I expected curses to rise from him. I expected, at the very least, some protest, some acknowledgement of the wrong he must have felt. Instead, what reached my ears through the din of the crowd and the thud of stone upon flesh was a prayer. Lord, do not hold this sin against them. Those words, though spoken in a low voice, struck me harder than their softness suggested. For a moment, something within me recoiled, as if a sudden hand had brushed against my skin. But I did not move. I did not allow my expression to change. I tightened my hold on the cloaks, the rough fabric pressing against my fingers, and reminded myself again that what I witnessed was righteousness, justice, faithfulness. When at last the stones ceased and the dust began to settle, Stephen lay upon the ground in a posture that left no doubt as to the result of our labor. The crowd, satisfied that the law had been served, began to disperse. I said nothing. I had no need to speak. My approval was, I believed, evident. As I made my way from that place, a peculiar sensation accompanied me. It was not regret. That emotion had not yet found any lodging in my heart. It was something more elusive, more troubling. A silence seemed to have taken up residence within me. It followed me through the streets, through the noise of the city, into the quiet of the night. I attempted, as I had always done, to dismiss anything that threatened the clarity of my convictions. I told myself that the day had unfolded as it ought, that the law had been upheld, that the death of one blasphemer was a small price to pay for the preservation of truth. But the silence did not depart. That night, when I lay upon my mat, I found sleep reluctant to visit me. Each time my eyes closed, the scene returned, repeating itself with merciless clarity. I saw again the lift of his face, the fall of the stones, and the strange serenity that shone from him, a light no shadow could extinguish. I rose, paced, prayed aloud, recited passages of Scripture. The words filled the room. They did nothing to dispel the stillness that had settled within me. Even now, in this cell, where memory has little to compete with, I see with distressing vividness the color of the blood that stained the ground that day. It did not vanish when the dust was disturbed by passing feet, and I have come to understand that it did not vanish from me. I was Saul of Tarsus, and though my eyes were open, I was blind. Chapter 5. Letters of Death. The letters reached me at dawn, the morning lending their arrival a gravity I did not then question. A courier from the high priest, a man of spare figure and searching eyes, placed them in my hands without ceremony. He spoke no word, but bowed in a manner that reflected the seriousness of his errand, then vanished into the cool recesses of the temple as he had come. I remained where I stood, the scrolls in my hands, heavier than parchment and wax. The seals, fresh from the press and bright with red, caught the early light and seemed almost to breathe. To my mind, they were more than official documents. They were confirmations, affirmations, tokens of trust placed in me by those whose judgment I held in the highest regard. I broke the first seal. The words were unadorned and exact, as the council's words ever were. Find them, arrest them, bring them to Jerusalem for trial. There was no ambiguity, no room for hesitation. It was, to my understanding, a commission of honor, a blessing upon my previous efforts, a declaration, if not of open war, then of an enterprise so near to it as to differ only in name. The night had given me little rest. I had spent its hours in prayer, pacing my chamber, reciting psalms, repeating the Shema until its words struck within me like a call to arms. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. I had spoken those words with such intensity that they seemed to vibrate in the air long after my voice fell silent. I told myself, as I had done so often, that what I was about to undertake was beyond a mere human endeavor. It was the work of God Himself. As the first light spread across the rooftops of Jerusalem and cast long shadows into the narrow streets, that familiar silence made its presence known once more. It had followed me since the death of Stephen, and now it returned, patient beyond endurance, unsettling me more than any accusation could have done. It lingered at the edge of my thoughts, neither yielding nor advancing, content to abide until I could no longer ignore it. I turned the scrolls over in my hands again, studying the red seals as if they might answer what I refused to ask. How I embraced authority when it came dressed in wax and ribbon. How I mistook permission for righteousness. I rose, shook the dust from my robes, and summoned my companions. We would depart within the hour. Damascus lay not so far distant as to excuse hesitation. 2 days, perhaps 3, would bring us to its gates. I was intent on ensuring that this time the followers of the way would not have opportunity to scatter before me. I would descend upon them as one who knows both his authority and his duty. Still, as I rolled the scrolls again and secured them for travel, a curious heaviness settled within my chest. I had known fear in other circumstances, and this sensation bore little resemblance to it. It felt deeper and colder, more enduring, as though some unseen hand had placed a stone beneath my ribs. I rebuked myself for entertaining such an impression. I was Saul of Tarsus, a Pharisee trained in the strictest observance of the law, a defender of the covenant. I possessed the confidence of the council, the authority of the high priest, the fervor of my convictions, and now, in my hands, these letters which seemed to justify all that I had done and all that I intended to do. Letters of death, though I would not have named them so at the time. When we passed out through the city gates, Jerusalem was already stirring into its daily activity. Merchants were arranging their wares. Priests moved toward the temple courts. The common sounds of the morning rose about us, bearing a familiarity that, on another day, would have offered comfort. No one turned an eye toward me. I could not shake the sense that my name moved ahead of me in lowered voices. Saul the Zealous. Saul, the instrument of the law. Saul, who would cleanse Israel of these troublesome heretics. I carried myself with the assurance of one who believes his course entirely justified. No uncertainty, I told myself, could find lodging in a mind such as mine. That silence, however, kept pace with me, constant as any companion at my side. It hung about us in the air, as tangible as the scrolls in my hands. I attributed it to the weight of recent events and to anything that would allow me to dismiss it without examination. A passing shadow, I assured myself, the stir of a distant footstep. The road beyond the gates stretched before us with a peculiar stillness. Even the hooves of the animals seemed to fall in hush upon the dust. Conversation among the men was sparse. I sensed, against my own reluctance, that our journey was leading toward something already set in motion. I told myself I was riding toward triumph. Beneath the carefully ordered thoughts with which I defended my composure, another awareness stirred, one I could not suppress. I rode with the confidence of a man certain of victory, unaware that each mile carried me closer to a reckoning. Chapter 6. The Road to Damascus. If there is any single moment to which I might point and say, with the solemnity of a witness under oath, here and not elsewhere, the course of my life was altered beyond recall, it is the moment I now struggle to set into words. For it gave no sign of its coming. It broke upon me in one overwhelming instant, the world I understood coming to an end. We were, by my reckoning, little more than half a day's ride from Damascus. The sun rode high above us, and the road stretched out in a long, unbroken line of dust. My beast moved in the steady rhythm of one accustomed to such journeys, and against my chest, secured beneath my garments, rested the scrolls whose authority had filled me with grim determination. I remember murmuring passages of Scripture under my breath as we rode. Their former comfort had grown distant. I clung to them as a soldier to his armor, drawing their familiar cadence about my thoughts in the hope that it might steady the unrest gathering within me. Then the light came, sudden and absolute. The air around me and something deeper within were overtaken by a brilliance beyond any natural light. It was more than sight. It struck me inwardly, entered and pierced me, and in a single, merciless instant laid bare every hidden recess of my being. I collapsed. My body could no longer sustain the weight within me. My bones seemed to give way like clay struck by sudden rain, my strength crumbling to dust, and I remember the taste of the road as my face met it. There was no sound that I could distinguish, and yet there was a voice. It reached me deeper than sound, striking somewhere within the marrow of my being. "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" The words carried no anger. Their clarity was enough. They left no refuge for denial. I could not breathe. Thought itself splintered. Everything upon which I had built my identity began to give way. The structure of my life no longer able to bear its own weight. My lips trembled. The voice that emerged from me did not sound like my own. It crept out, like the last breath of a man at the point of death. "Who are you, Lord?" The answer came at once, allowing no interval for doubt. "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." The name burned. It moved through me and through my past alike, touching every door I had broken, every face I had seized, every cry I had silenced. That single name gathered up all the fragments of my past and set them before me in one devastating revelation. I am Jesus, the crucified, the one I had called heretic, whose followers I had hunted without mercy. I, who had imagined myself a servant of God, stood revealed as his enemy. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the light withdrew, but it left behind a darkness so complete that I struggled to comprehend it. I lifted my hands toward my face, as though I might push aside some physical obstruction, but nothing changed. I blinked repeatedly, hoping for the return of even the faintest shadow of sight, but there was no difference between open eyes and closed. I heard the voices of my companions, raised in confusion. I felt hands grasp at my arms, at my shoulders. "Saul, Saul, what has happened?" I could not answer them. What explanation could I offer? That the God I had professed to serve had confronted me with the truth of my actions. That the name I had sought to erase had spoken into my very being and undone me. I cannot see. They lifted me to my feet. My legs faltered beneath me. I stumbled like a child learning to walk. To my own astonishment, I found tears upon my face. They came from understanding, and understanding frightened me more than pain ever had. I had seen too much, and now I could see nothing. They led me, guiding my uncertain steps, into Damascus. The journey that had been intended as a march of authority became instead a procession of helplessness. The men who had followed me in confidence now spoke to me in lowered voices, fearing that any louder word might shatter what remained of me. I, who had intended to enter that city as a judge, crossed its threshold as a blind supplicant. For 3 days I remained without sight. I took no food. I spoke few words. The world, once etched in hard lines within my mind, had dissolved into a darkness that seemed to stretch on without end. Time itself lost its measure. Day and night differed only by the sounds that reached my ears from beyond the walls. In that darkness, the silence that had followed me for so long deepened. It gathered around me, pressed upon me, haunted me, to the point where I surrendered myself to it. I lay upon the floor, feeling the roughness of the ground beneath me, and for the first time in my life, I ceased striving. I did not argue within myself. I did not marshal passages of Scripture to defend my thoughts. I did not attempt to justify what had been revealed to me. I existed within that thick, impenetrable blackness, and listened. I began to understand that the silence I had feared was not empty. It had been following me through council chambers, through narrow streets, through broken doors and shouted accusations, through the death of Stephen and the issuing of letters. The silence had always been him. Now he had spoken. Chapter 7. 3 Days in Darkness. They led me by the hand, I, who had walked the courts of Jerusalem with the confidence of one accustomed to being followed rather than guided, entered Damascus like an infirm beggar rescued from the roadside. My feet moved, but I did not feel the ground beneath them. My lips, which had once delivered forceful arguments, could not summon even the simplest word. The grit of the journey lay upon my skin and gathered in my mouth. It seemed to me less the residue of travel than the remains of a life already burned away. I was conducted into a house belonging to one whose name I did not then know. They placed me upon a resting place, and one by one my companions withdrew. They had heard no voice as I had. They had seen no light. They had seen me, and the sight of me troubled them more than the event itself. I was no longer the man who had set out with them from Jerusalem. The room, as I later discovered, was small. To me, it might as well have been boundless. Darkness lay over me like a second garment, inseparable and complete. Had the walls been ablaze with torches, I should not have known it. The world, which had once presented itself to me in such confident outlines, had dissolved into an obscurity so thorough that I began to wonder whether sight itself had ever truly belonged to me. I waited. I wept. I did not eat or sleep. I cannot say that I felt myself a man in those hours. I was a wound laid open, left to contemplate its own depth. The voice from the road echoed continually within me, as though the words had been inscribed upon the inner walls of my being. "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" The question did not accuse in the manner of men. It exposed. It forced me to look upon my own history as I had never permitted myself before. How many lives had I broken under the assurance that I served God? How many prayers had been silenced by my command? How many tears had fallen because I believed myself righteous? Faces returned to me in a clarity the darkness could not diminish. Women crying out as I tore their husbands from their grasp. Children shrinking into corners, wide-eyed in fear. The hard stone floors upon which men had knelt in chains. Above them all, Stephen's face, illumined by that strange tranquility, his lips forming words of forgiveness as the stones did their work. I had called it justice. I had called it holiness. I had called it love for the law. Now, in the quiet of that room, I called it by its proper name. Blindness. In that darkness, I expected nothing less than the end of myself. My body endured. I felt my heart beating with stubborn regularity. What faltered was the man I had believed myself to be. For how could one continue after standing face to face with the truth he had spent his life attempting to destroy? No voice returned to me in those hours. No light pierced the gloom. Only that heavy, patient silence remained, more present than any sound. It seemed to sit beside me like a companion who had waited many years for this moment and now refused to depart. Thus passed the first day, then the second. On the third, I became aware of movement beyond the stillness that had enclosed me. There was a knock upon the door, followed by the sound of footsteps entering the room. I stiffened, uncertain whether I dreaded or desired what might follow. A voice spoke, hesitant yet kind. "Brother Saul." The words startled me. "My name is Ananias," the voice continued. "The Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on the road, has sent me." I felt hands upon my face. They were gentle, with the care one gives to something fragile. "That you may see again and be filled with the Holy Spirit." A gasp escaped me before I could prevent it. It seemed in that instant that the darkness itself cracked, as though some unseen barrier had been lifted. I blinked repeatedly, and what I had believed lost forever returned to me in a form entirely new. It was a soft light, like that of early morning, stealing gradually into a room. Shapes emerged. The outline of a man, his features uncertain at first, then clear. His eyes were wide, betraying a mixture of apprehension and determination. He did not regard me as one would regard a criminal or an enemy. There was, in his expression, a compassion I did not deserve and could scarcely meet. He had called me brother. That single word accomplished what accusation never could. It struck with greater force than the light itself. It told me that the man I had been was not the man I must remain. Tears came then, free and without restraint. I made no attempt to conceal them. The man who had prided himself upon composure found himself unable to command even his own countenance. They helped me to my feet. My legs trembled as though I had only just learned their use. My breath came in uneven measures. Supported on either side, I was led from that room toward water. I felt its coolness rise about my ankles, then my knees, then my waist. I closed my eyes and surrendered myself to the purity of the moment. For the first time, I released my hold upon Saul and let him sink beneath the surface. Chapter 8. Washed Clean. When I rose from the water, my limbs trembled, unsteady in a way I had never allowed myself to admit. Even the effort of standing felt unfamiliar, as if I had entered the world again on uncertain ground. My breath labored for a moment, then settled. They led me from the water and into the house. My eyes were open once more. A quiet light lay upon the walls, entering by the narrow window beyond. Though the world appeared outwardly unchanged, I could not escape the conviction that everything had been changed beyond recognition. The same walls enclosed me, the same sky stretched above the city, the same dust lay upon the floor. But I, who observed these things, was no longer the man who had first entered Damascus with scrolls pressed against his chest and purpose blazing in his mind. That man had been undone when truth stood before him in such clarity that no defense remained. I had, in a manner difficult to express, died, and something unfamiliar and uncertain now occupied the place I had once called my own. It bore the mark of humility. Ananias placed a fresh robe about my shoulders. The cloth carried the faint scent of oil and frankincense. To my senses, it bore something more, a mercy I could not then name. It rested upon me in a gentleness that stood apart from the iron and authority I had once worn with ease. He spoke little, and I found that I desired no conversation. There are moments in a man's life when language proves wholly inadequate to the magnitude of what has occurred within him. Silence, in such moments, becomes a form of reverence. He set bread before me. I took it. The taste struck me as unfamiliar, almost distant. Each motion of my jaw drew me back into the weight and warmth of my own flesh. The quiet between us was of a sacred quality, and I might have wished it to last indefinitely. But the world beyond the walls of that house had already begun to stir, and it would not long permit such stillness. News travels with remarkable speed, particularly when it concerns a man whose name has been so frequently spoken as mine had been. Word spread that the persecutor of the followers of Jesus had entered Damascus and had fallen into an inexplicable silence. The man who had arrived bearing letters of authority was now said to be praying behind a closed door, while rumors gathered in his place. Speculation multiplied, as it always does when certainty falters. Some declared me mad, struck senseless by the heat of the journey or the strain of my own zeal. Others, more suspicious, whispered that I had devised some elaborate pretense in order to infiltrate the very people I had come to destroy. A few, I am told, dared to wonder whether something beyond ordinary explanation had taken place, though they spoke of such thoughts in guarded tones. When at last I ventured into the streets again, I did so alone. The faces I passed regarded me with expressions that ranged from curiosity to open hostility. Some turned away as though my presence offended them. Others spat upon the ground in unmistakable contempt. I felt each glance like a physical touch, each murmur after me like an echo. Drawn by an impulse I did not understand, I made my way toward the synagogue. The familiarity of the place struck me. The scrolls, the pillars, the arrangement of the room, even a few of the faces gathered there, were known to me. It was a setting in which I had once moved with authority, confident that my voice would be received with respect, if not with admiration. But when I opened my mouth to speak, the air seemed to thicken about me. Every eye fixed upon me, leaving no space for retreat. Every ear inclined in suspicion rather than expectation. I spoke the name I had once uttered only with disdain: Jesus of Nazareth. In trembling earnestness, I declared that he was the Messiah. The reaction was immediate. A sharp intake of breath ran through the room, followed by a low rumbling that swelled into voices raised in indignation. "Is this not the man," someone cried, "who ravaged Jerusalem, who came here with the same intent?" They regarded me with fear, with anger, and with a disbelief so intense that it felt like hatred. I saw in their faces the reflection of what I myself must have looked like when I had stood in judgment over others. In that moment, I felt the full cost of what had taken place upon the road to Damascus. In losing my sight and receiving it again, I had discovered that what was truly gone was my place in the world I once knew. Those whose approval I had prized now viewed me as a traitor. Those with whom I sought fellowship regarded me as a danger whose innocence had not been established. I found myself suspended between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. Between two names, one that clung to me with the weight of my past, and another not yet fully formed in the minds of those around me. Saul, in truth, had perished, but Paul, though destined to live, was still in the difficult and painful process of being born. Chapter 9. Apostle or Traitor? I returned to Jerusalem as a stranger to the very stones that had once seemed to acknowledge my passage. No gathering awaited me at the gates. No familiar elder inclined his head in recognition. No summons came from the council chambers where I had once stood with such assurance. The city itself appeared unchanged. Smoke still rose in thin spirals above the rooftops. The narrow streets still carried the mingled sounds of prayer and dispute. The temple still crowned the hill of Zion, visible across the valleys of Judea, its white stones gleaming beneath the sun. I walked beneath its arches as though I possessed no rightful claim upon the ground. Where once I had moved as a man known and consulted, I now advanced like a shadow, uncertain where to rest my gaze, or how long I might remain unnoticed. I was no longer the hammer of the law, nor even its defender. I had become something more troubling to those who remembered me, a man marked by suspicion. The disciples of the way did not come to me, and I could not have expected them to, so I went to them. Through whispered directions and doors that seemed to close more readily than they opened, I traced my way to the place where they were said to gather. The house itself was unremarkable, indistinguishable from many others in the street. To me, it stood apart. I slowed as I drew near, aware that my presence alone might unsettle the quiet within. I knocked. There was no response. I knocked again and waited. No sound reached me from within. Only after a delay long enough to invite retreat did I hear the faint movement of someone approaching the door. The faces that met mine were fearful. These were men and women who had spoken boldly in the temple courts and had faced hardship at my hands. They knew who I was. They had felt the weight of my rebuke. At the sight of me, they stepped back as if death itself had crossed their threshold. I spoke carefully, my words halting in a manner that would once have humiliated me. I told them of the road, of the light that had undone me, of the voice that had spoken my name, of the blindness that followed, of the days spent in darkness, of Ananias, of the water, of the mercy that had found me when I had neither sought nor deserved it. I spoke plainly, with no embellishment, trusting that truth might accomplish what persuasion never could. But it was not enough. "He is lying," someone whispered. "He has come to spy," said another. "To finish what he began," a third added. Then a voice, quieter but heavier than the rest, spoke a single name: Stephen. So did I remember him. I remembered him each day with a clarity that allowed no escape. I attempted to speak again, but the words faltered and died in my throat. It is a grievous thing to be judged for what one has been, especially when the judgment is entirely just. I could not resent their suspicion. Had our positions been reversed, I would have felt the same. I turned to leave, intended to withdraw without further disturbance. As I did so, a hand rested lightly upon my shoulder. "Wait," said a voice behind me. It was quiet, and its steadiness compelled attention. I turned and saw Barnabas. There was something in his expression I had not encountered in the others. He looked at me without reducing me to the Saul of former days. His gaze lingered as if he discerned something still forming, incomplete and unmistakable. "Tell me again," he said quietly. I told him again. This time I spoke only to him. There was no effort to persuade, no attempt to soften my account for the sake of acceptance. I told the story as a man who had nothing left to defend. I spoke of the voice, of the darkness, of the tears I had not restrained. I spoke as one already stripped of reputation. When I finished, Barnabas regarded me for a long moment. Then he nodded once, the look in his eyes suggesting that some inward reckoning had reached its conclusion. He turned to the others, placing himself in the doorway so that his figure commanded the room. "I have heard his account," he said. I believe him. Words alone do not persuade me, but I discern in him a fire not kindled by his own will." He paused, and the silence that followed seemed to gather weight. "I have seen men speak from pride, and men speak from fear. This is neither. There is another voice at work in him." The room shifted at that. Suspicion lingered, fear with it, but their grip had slackened like a fist slowly uncurled. They stepped aside and allowed me to enter. There was no joy in their welcome. There was only cautious acceptance and watchful glances that reminded me I still had much to prove, and perhaps could never fully repay what I had destroyed. But a door, long closed against me, now stood open. With a humility I had never before possessed, I stepped through. Chapter 10. Into the Wilderness. There are certain truths which refuse to be borne amid the clamor of men, and certain wounds which decline to reveal their full character until a man stands alone beneath an open sky. I had learned in Jerusalem that I could not hear the quiet voice within me for the multitude of voices without. Faces, memories, suspicions, and whispers pressed so closely upon my thoughts that I found myself unable to breathe freely in their presence. After that uneasy reception, I departed. It was not danger that drove me away, for I had already come to understand that danger would be my companion wherever I chose to dwell. It was noise I fled, noise, and the continual reflection of myself in the eyes of others, who still perceived the shadow of Saul where I struggled to speak as Paul. Each look seemed to summon the man I had been, and I knew that if I remained, I should never learn who I was becoming. I turned my steps eastward, into Arabia, into a land where heat and silence conspire to strip a man of every unnecessary pretense. I sought no companions. I asked no counsel. I carried with me no scrolls beyond those already inscribed upon my memory. There was only the wind moving across barren ground, the rocks standing unmoved beneath the sun, and the unsettling nearness of God. I cannot say with certainty how long I remained there. Time in the wilderness does not submit itself readily to counting. It moves like breath, sometimes shallow and swift, sometimes lingering until it becomes almost unbearable. Days passed that felt like hours, and hours that felt like entire seasons. But I know this much. I remained long enough for the fire within me to change its nature entirely. I fasted often, though not from any deliberate exercise of piety. Food seemed strangely foreign to me, as though my body had not yet grown accustomed to being inhabited by this altered spirit. The hunger I felt did not reside chiefly in my stomach. It lay deeper, in the recesses of my mind and soul, gnawing at questions I had never before permitted myself to ask. So I prayed. I cried aloud into the vastness of the desert, where no human ear could overhear my confession. I recited the law, which I had once wielded as a weapon. I whispered the psalms I had learned in childhood, words that had once filled me with pride at my own mastery. But now those same words struck different chords within me. They no longer sharpened my sense of superiority. They undid me. They became mirrors in which I was forced to see myself without disguise. I remembered Abraham wandering without knowledge of his destination. I remembered Moses alone upon Sinai. I thought of Elijah hiding in the cave. I could not escape the knowledge that even Jesus had withdrawn into the wilderness before stepping fully into his calling. I began to understand that I was not the first man to be broken before being sent. There were moments in that solitude when I became aware of God so clearly that it left no room for disappointment, as though every lesser thought had quietly withdrawn. At such times, I suppressed even my breath, lest I disturb what surrounded me. At other hours, I felt only the faint rhythm of my own breathing and the steady beating of my heart against my ribs. Doubt would draw near then, and silence seemed to stretch without boundary. I remained and listened. In that waiting, words began to take shape within me. They were fragments at first, prayers formed in struggle, questions pressed into understanding, truths tested in solitude before they were ever spoken aloud. I did not then foresee that these inward wrestlings would one day find expression in words carried across seas and read in distant cities. I knew only that something was being formed in me that would not remain hidden. Then, they were simply the outpourings of a man who could no longer remain silent within himself. I did not understand grace, but I felt its absence as a man feels the lack of water in a parched land. I did not know how to speak of the Spirit, but I sensed its movement within me, like a trembling that would not be stilled. The man who entered Arabia carried Saul with him still, like a shadow that clung stubbornly to his steps. The man who departed from it did not. When at last I turned my face once more toward the cities of men, I returned with something far less visible and infinitely more powerful than any scroll of authority or the sword of the law. A truth that had reduced me to my very bones. A truth I could neither contain nor ignore. A truth that I knew must now be carried to the ends of the earth. Chapter 11. The Mission Begins. I returned from the wilderness with feet hardened by long travel, a frame made lean by privation, and a fire lodged so deep within me that I could not have extinguished it had I tried. The fire within me had altered in nature. Pride no longer fed it, nor did judgment give it shape. It burned steadily, without display, without urgency, sustaining rather than consuming. My steps led me first to Antioch. The brethren there approached me as men wary of one once feared and long absent, uncertain whether I had come bearing peace or disturbance. Their eyes held something I could not name, a watchfulness shaped by memory. I had learned by then that trust, once broken, does not mend at the pace the penitent might desire. And there, in that city of mixed tongues and mingled customs, where Greeks argued beside Syrians and Jews prayed amid the press of commerce, I found again the one man whose presence had altered the course of my life almost as surely as the light upon the road. Barnabas. He who had once stood in a doorway and declared that he believed me, now stood beside me as though the intervening months had only strengthened his loyalty. He walked with me. He prayed with me. He listened with me. His trust was quiet, almost hidden, though unmistakably firm, and it steadied me more than any praise could have done. Together we joined the elders and prophets of the assembly in fasting and prayer. Then we waited, as I had learned to wait in the desert, attentive to that quiet movement which cannot be summoned by will or secured by effort. In the midst of such waiting, the Spirit spoke. Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul, for the work to which I have called them. The words ended discussion. They carried the weight of inevitability. We gathered close and prayed together, committing ourselves to what had been set before us. Delay had run its course. So we went. To Cyprus first, where my feet touched the sea for the first time since Arabia had claimed them. The salt wind carried with it a sense of widening horizons, as though the world itself were leaning closer to hear what might be spoken. Then onward to Perga, to Pisidian Antioch, to Iconium, to Lystra. Our journey unfolded without any design we could claim as our own. We moved as doors opened before us, and as often as they closed. We spoke wherever we were given opportunity, in synagogues, in markets, in courtyards. Sometimes we were welcomed. More often, we were merely tolerated. Some listened with interest, some with scorn, some with stones already in their hands. In the beginning, Barnabas did much of the speaking. I watched and listened, content to follow his lead, wary of my own voice. As the days passed, words began to form within me, clearer each time I tried to dismiss them. In time, I understood that they must be spoken. I spoke of the cross as one who had been changed by it. Grace had become to me a necessity, no mere idea. Christ was no memory from the past, but the Lord who had met me on the road and altered the course of my life. The people listened. Gentiles wept, astonished to find themselves addressed as heirs. Jews entered earnest dispute, their hearts stirred despite themselves. The sick were brought before us and rose restored. Those tormented in mind and spirit cried out and then fell silent, as if a long war within them had finally come to its end. In Lystra, an incident occurred that I shall never forget. The people, overwhelmed by what they witnessed, concluded that Barnabas and I must be gods in human form. They brought garlands and beasts for sacrifice, calling us by names drawn from their own myths. The absurdity of it struck me with sorrow. I tore my robe and cried out to them that we were but men of flesh and bone like themselves, subject to hunger, pain, and death. Even truth, plainly spoken, did not prevent misunderstanding. The same crowd that would have worshipped us at noon gathered stones by evening. I was dragged from the city, struck repeatedly, and left upon the ground, motionless. I remember the sky darkening above me, the taste of blood, and that familiar, heavy silence descending once more. But I did not die. Bruised and near collapse, I rose. The brethren gathered around me with a question. Why return? Why not withdraw? Why not preserve what little strength remained? Because I had not been brought this far merely to survive. My calling bound me to testimony. So I spoke again. We established assemblies in the places we visited, gatherings of men and women whose lives had been altered by the same mercy that had altered mine. We appointed elders, taught them what we had learned, broke bread together, and entrusted to them the care of what had begun. Then we moved on, always forward, always exposed, always aware that danger walked beside us as faithfully as any companion. Nevertheless, we were never alone. Chapter 12. To the Gentiles. It began, as many of the most troublesome matters do, with a question so plain in its phrasing that one might overlook the disturbance it concealed. Must a man become a Jew before he can follow Christ? The words arose from honest bewilderment. As they were uttered, I felt they carried within them the power to unsettle long-standing arrangements and to test the patience of many who had grown comfortable in their understanding of what obedience required. I did not answer at once. My convictions were firm. I understood what such an answer would cost. It would touch traditions that had stood for generations. It would strain alliances already made fragile by change. It would disturb a peace which, though imperfect, many preferred to any new contention. But I had seen too much to hide behind caution. I had watched Gentiles, whose lives bore no resemblance to the strict observances of our people, weep at the name of Jesus. I had entered their homes, seen their idols cast aside, their tables opened in hospitality, their hearts laid bare so sincerely that they required no embellishment. I had witnessed healings among them, both of the body and of that deeper place within a man where despair often resides. Never in all those encounters had I found myself compelled to demand of them the sign of Abraham before speaking to them of Christ. I knew, therefore, what my answer must be. No. I did not speak out of disregard for the law or from any belief that it had failed. I had come to see that it had reached its fulfillment in the person of Jesus. In him, its purpose was completed. This understanding, however, did not find ready acceptance among all. In Antioch, the discussions opened with courtesy, yet beneath it there ran a tension that soon rose to the surface. Voices rose, arguments echoed through gathering places and private rooms alike. Those among us who had been raised within the traditions of our people, and who had embraced faith in Jesus without relinquishing their attachment to the law, regarded the inclusion of Gentiles without such observance as a scandal rather than a triumph. Barnabas sought to steady the rising tension. He reminded us of shared prayers, of shared dangers, of the mercy that had first drawn us together. Even his measured voice began to falter beneath the weight of convictions that no longer wished to bend. At length I stood. "You would bind," I said, "where God has unbound. You would rebuild the wall he has torn down with his own hand." The words did not fall gently. I was accused of pride, of casting aside the law, of corrupting what had been preserved. Some spoke as though I sought to erase our fathers, to sever myself from the people into whom I had been born. I answered them with the only authority I possessed, my own story. "I, Saul of Tarsus," I said, "once pursued this church with an unbreakable faith. I know what the law can do to a man's heart when it becomes his idol instead of his guide. I know how devotion hardens into violence. But I tell you this, I have seen the Spirit of God fall upon Gentiles as surely as upon any of us. And I will not stand by while we attempt to make God smaller than he has revealed himself to be." The room divided. Some nodded, as though recognizing a truth they had long resisted. Others withdrew in visible displeasure. A few departed altogether, unable to reconcile what they had heard with what they had long believed. Beneath the fracture of that disagreement, I sensed that a way had been made for us by a mercy greater than our division. So we went to the Gentiles. We spoke to them in their own tongues. We quoted their poets when it served to illuminate what their hearts already sensed but had never named. We entered cities where customs offended every habit of our upbringing, where pigs were held in esteem and pleasure was pursued as a god, and we spoke to them of a crucified Jewish carpenter who had risen from the grave. They listened. Not all, not even most, but enough. They knelt beside the remnants of broken idols. They shared bread with Jews who, in former days, would not have crossed their thresholds. They heard the same gospel proclaimed, and from it drew the same conclusion: grace. There were, of course, rumors that reached my ears even as we traveled from place to place. Paul has betrayed Moses. Paul has abandoned the covenant. I let them speak, for I had already determined where my allegiance lay, with the cross. Chapter 13. Suffering for the Name. There are blows in a man's life that arrive with warning enough to permit him the dignity of preparation, and there are others which fall in an instant so that he does not know he has been struck until he finds himself upon the ground, wondering when the earth rose to meet him. Iconium offered little warning. The crowd's temper sharpened abruptly, and violence followed close behind. It began, as such disturbances often do, with a whisper passed from one mouth to another, gaining confidence with every repetition. Paul defiles the temple. Paul blasphemes Moses. Paul speaks of Gentiles as sons of Abraham. I saw the change in their faces before I felt the first hand upon me. Eyes that had once been merely curious hardened into something far less forgiving. The judgment already settled without the inconvenience of deliberation. Then came the blows. I remember arms moving in abrupt, decisive gestures, bodies closing in from every side, and voices rising into a single, furious uproar. The crowd lifted me from my footing, driven by a shared conviction that I should remain among them no longer. What followed survives only in broken impressions. When I came to myself, blood filled my mouth. It had dried along my lips and tightened the skin of my face. Barnabas was beside me, his garment torn, his breathing uneven, though he strove to appear composed. For a moment we remained where we had fallen. Understanding came without clamor. Those who had risen against us were men shaped by the same scriptures that had once formed my own convictions. They believed they were defending the inheritance of Abraham. In proclaiming that the Gentiles might enter the promise without first passing through the customs of our fathers, we had touched a boundary guarded with fierce devotion. As I pushed myself upright, every movement answered by pain, I saw what lay ahead. The message entrusted to me would carry us beyond the hostility of pagan cities. It would place us in opposition to our own people. What had begun as dispute had hardened into division, and division into accusation. The stones had spoken. Lystra followed, then Philippi, Thessalonica, Ephesus. Each city in its turn became a place where the message I carried was received with wonder by some and with fury by others. Every sermon felt like a wager laid against the pride of men. Every night closed with the knowledge that morning was not guaranteed. There was an irony in these events which I could not ignore. Once, I had been the one who entered homes with authority, dragging men into the streets for the sake of what I believed to be righteousness. Now, I was the one pulled through those same streets, borne along by the anger of others. I do not recount these things with any desire for admiration. I speak of them rather with a kind of quiet astonishment. That Christ, in His mercy, should not only have called me to speak of His resurrection, but to share in some small measure the suffering that accompanied it, was a thought that humbled me beyond speech. I, who had once inflicted pain in His name, was now permitted to bear pain for it. Of all these memories, Philippi stands apart, nearer to me than the rest. The prison there lay deep within the earth, damp and unwholesome. Our feet were secured in stocks, our backs still burning from lashes delivered in anger. Beside me, Barnabas began to hum the familiar lines of a psalm. At first, the sound was little more than a thread of melody, careful and restrained, mindful of the guard beyond the door. It grew steadier. He no longer measured each note, but allowed the tune to take its natural course. The song moved through the cramped chamber and returned to us from stone and iron, carrying with it a quiet defiance that no chain could silence. And I, to my own surprise, felt tears gather in my eyes, from joy. For in that moment, deprived of comfort and bereft of reputation, I understood with a depth I had never before attained the words I had once read and admired without comprehending their true weight. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. In that place I did not feel cursed, nor did I sense abandonment. A different awareness took hold of me, one I cannot render into language. I felt myself drawn nearer to the heart of the one whose name I bore, brought into closer fellowship with His sufferings, and made more conscious of the life that sustained my own. The suffering refined my voice. It lent it a strength that persuasion alone could never have produced. Each scar upon my body became, in my mind, a sentence in the testimony I bore. Each wound a word, each prison an unexpected pulpit from which truth could still be spoken. There were nights when I could not stand upright, and mornings when lifting my hands felt a labor beyond my remaining strength. Still I spoke. Something within me burned so steadily that pain could not extinguish it, a flame that persisted. They broke my bones, yet the message prevailed. Its endurance belonged to another, to one whose life had entered death itself and emerged untouched by its finality. Chapter 14, Where Wisdom Gathers. Athens received me with a curiosity that, though not unkind, carried within it a faint air of amusement. It was the sort of attention one bestows upon traveling performers, wandering philosophers, or those unfortunate souls whose excess of wine has loosened their tongues beyond prudence. I was observed, weighed, and appraised as one might examine a passing curiosity, my message treated as little more than a diversion. The city itself seemed to breathe an air of learning, or what passed among its inhabitants for learning. At every turn, statues rose from the ground, as though the earth had grown weary of bearing so many names and chosen to display them. Apollo stood confident. Athena gazed with sculpted wisdom. Dionysus reclined in perpetual indulgence. Countless others surrounded them, their marble eyes fixed forever upon nothing at all. Altars crowded the streets like milestones, marking the restless progress of human imagination. The marketplace hummed with debate and discussion as people bartered ideas more feverishly than goods. Men gathered in knots and circles, their hands in constant motion, their voices rising and falling in enthusiasm. Arguments were offered, withdrawn, reshaped, and offered again. Truth was handled like a coin, turned over for inspection, then exchanged for another of equal novelty. "Tell us something new," they seemed to say with their eyes, as if the value of a thing lay not in its truth, but in its unfamiliarity. As was my custom, I began in the synagogue, there among those who at least shared some knowledge of the Scriptures. I reasoned with them from the law and the prophets, drawing lines they could recognize and building upon foundations they had inherited. My words fell and seemed to sink without disturbance, as though cast into a depth that refused to answer. Faces regarded me with courtesy, nodding at intervals, though without the engagement I had learned to expect. They listened, but they did not lean in. They heard, but they did not receive. It was then that I was invited to the Areopagus. The place itself impressed the eye. Marble steps ascended toward a gathering of men robed in colors that spoke of distinction and study. Their composure conveyed the impression that time itself stood ready to indulge their examination of another idea. Their expressions held a blend of curiosity and faint condescension, the look of those accustomed to weighing fresh ideas without ever submitting themselves to the scale. They gestured for me to speak, and I perceived in their manner an unspoken sentiment. Let the foreigner present his curiosity. I did not resent it. I had long since learned that truth does not require reverence in order to remain true. "Men of Athens," I began, "I perceive that in every way you are very religious." A subtle movement passed through the assembly. Eyebrows lifted. A few exchanged glances. I had at least secured their attention. "For as I passed through your city," I continued, "I found among your many altars one bearing this inscription: 'To an unknown God.' What therefore you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you." I spoke then of the God who made heaven and earth, who does not dwell in temples built by hands, nor depend upon human service, lacking nothing. I spoke of the one who gives life and breath to all, who determined the times and places of nations that they might seek him. I spoke of the man he had appointed, whom he had raised from the dead as assurance to all. At the mention of resurrection, I felt it at once. The air shifted. Some maintained a narrow courtesy that carried an unmistakable edge. Others allowed their amusement to show, listening as if I had offered an intriguing legend to their ongoing discourse. To many of them, the idea of bodily resurrection was not offensive so much as quaint, a notion fit for poets and dreamers, not for minds trained in disciplined speculation. Yet a few leaned forward. They listened with care, weighing what they heard for its coherence. I remained with them and finished what had been entrusted to me. When my words were spent, the response was nothing but quiet dispersal. "An interesting thought," one remarked. "We shall hear you again on this matter," said another, with the tone of one who has already turned to the next amusement. They departed without anger, without hostility, without any visible wound to pride or order. And I found that this wounded me more than blows ever had. A stone leaves its mark upon the flesh. Indifference settles upon the spirit like a weight for which there is no bruise to show. I stood for a time among those statues, surrounded by the likenesses of gods who neither hear nor speak, and wondered whether my voice had dissolved into the air, unheard and unremembered. But memory returned, as it so often did, with its quiet insistence. I remembered the road, the light, the voice that had called my name. I remembered the silence that had followed me with such constancy that I once mistook it for emptiness. And with that memory came a steadier understanding of my purpose. I had not been sent to secure approval from the learned or applause from the wise. I had been sent to bear witness. Later, a man approached me, Dionysius, a member of the council. With him came a woman named Damaris and a few others. Their questions were sincere, their attention steady. They believed. Chapter 15. Divided Church, Divided Heart. There is a species of pain which a man anticipates when he ventures among strangers, a pain administered by unfamiliar hands and borne with a certain grim preparedness. It arrives without disguise and may be met with courage. There is another pain, more searching and harder to withstand, that arises within the circle of those a man has come to love. I had long believed that if Christ were preached with clarity and sincerity, the assemblies formed in His name would stand with a firmness equal to their calling. I imagined that grace, once received, would secure unity as naturally as breath follows life. I trusted that the Spirit, who had bound my own shattered soul into something whole, would preserve them without the labor and anguish I was now to learn accompanied every living thing. In this, I discovered how incomplete my understanding had been. The messages began to arrive. There were reports of contention, of whispered rivalries, of voices raised in debate and comparison where truth was once spoken in joy. Men had begun to align themselves with names instead of Christ. "I am of Paul," one declared. "I am of Apollos," insisted another. "I am of Cephas," proclaimed a third. They had forgotten that none of us had been crucified for them, that none of us had shed blood for their redemption, that none of us had purchased them at any price beyond the labor of proclamation. Servants they had made into banners, messengers into masters. When first I read these reports, I laid them aside and paced the room in silence. My heart felt a new and unfamiliar weight settle upon it. I had suffered lashes, imprisonment, hunger, and threat without faltering. But this wound, delivered by those I loved, found no armor ready to meet it. I wrote to them. My words were filled with love, but it was a love mixed with the fear that something delicate and precious had begun to crack. "Is Christ divided?" I asked them. "Was Paul crucified for you? Were you baptized in my name?" I reminded them of the cross as a cost that ought to humble every mouth that dared to boast. I called to mind the days when we had broken bread together without suspicion, when, instead of arguments, prayers had risen from us. I reminded them of tears shed in simplicity, of hope shared without calculation. As I wrote, another thought pressed upon me with unwelcome persistence. What if they did not hear? For beneath their disputes about teachers, about freedoms, about the shape of obedience, I sensed something far older and far more dangerous moving among them. Pride. The same pride that had once governed my own steps. The same pride that convinces a man he stands upright when he is already leaning toward ruin. The same pride that blinds even as it quotes Scripture with perfect accuracy. This realization stirred sorrow within me. These were men and women whose names I knew, whose faces I could still summon with painful clarity. I had baptized some with my own hands. I had eaten at their tables, slept beneath their roofs, prayed over their children. I had watched faith awaken in them like morning light, and rejoiced as one rejoices over new life. Now they quarreled over shadows and called it teaching. I did not cease writing. I did not cease praying, but something within me shifted. I relinquished an expectation I had once held without question. I no longer assumed that peace would be the church's natural condition. I began to understand that the body of Christ, though beautiful, is also fragile. Though holy, it bears wounds. Though filled with the Spirit, it must still learn, with faltering steps, how to walk in the freedom it has been given. In those days, I felt not unlike a father watching his children dispute over trifles, each convinced of his own rightness, each unaware of the injury he inflicted upon the others. My love for them did not diminish. If anything, it deepened, even as my heart seemed to fracture under the weight of concern. There were moments when I longed to withdraw, to entrust them to God and spare myself the ache of watching their missteps. But I could not. Love does not permit such economy. Grace, once received, demands to be spent. I remembered that Christ had not abandoned me. If he could show such patience toward Saul of Tarsus, then Paul, though weary and wounded in spirit, could learn to bear with the slow and painful growth of those he loved. For the church, like every living thing, grows not without strain. And grace, I was learning, is the power to remain within it despite the struggle. Chapter 16. The Thorn in My Flesh. There are matters in a man's life which, despite their importance, he speaks of only in passing, because their weight resists the neat confinements of language. Such things refuse to be catalogued, measured, or explained without remainder. They must be carried rather than displayed. I have often alluded, in my letters and in my speech, to a certain affliction that accompanied me through many years. I called it a thorn. It made no display of itself, yet it remained. It lodged itself within the ordinary course of my days and refused every attempt at removal. The injuries delivered by whips, stones, and chains came with violence and departed with time. They left scars, but they did not walk beside me morning after morning. This did. I had been whipped until my back no longer distinguished pain from sensation. I had been stoned and left for dead. I had known hunger sharp enough to hollow the spirit, cold that settled into the bones, and the slow erosion of imprisonment. I had faced crowds whose rage required only a spark, and rulers whose favor could vanish as quickly as it was granted. None of these, severe as they were, constituted my truest affliction. That lay elsewhere. It revealed itself in small and unremarkable ways. In the stiffness that greeted me when I rose from rest, in the slight tremor that visited my voice when I spoke beyond the limits of my strength, in a weight beneath my ribs, like something pressing inward, never lifting, never declaring itself. At times, it bore the character of bodily weakness. At others, it assumed the shape of a heaviness of spirit for which no clear cause could be named. The thorn, as I came to understand it, was a truth to be learned. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord that it might depart from me. I asked, as a man accustomed to being heard, laying bare every corner of my reasoning before God. I believed that its removal would render me more useful. With greater strength, I reasoned, I might travel farther, speak longer, bear more. I imagined efficiency to be a virtue he must favor. Each time, no answer came. Then, at last, a word was given. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. After that, I asked no more. The answer took residence where my petition had once lived. It filled the space so completely that no further request could find footing there. I began to perceive that what I had regarded as an impediment had been granted as an instrument. I had spent much of my life learning to be strong in knowledge, strong in discipline, strong in argument, strong in survival. I had been trained to admire such strength, to cultivate it, to trust it. I believed it the proper foundation for service, the proof of readiness, the mark of usefulness. Yet it was weakness that taught me what I most needed to know. It was helplessness that taught me faith, for faith does not take root where a man still trusts in his own strength. It was limitation that instructed me in love, for love requires patience with what cannot be controlled. The thorn restrained me when praise threatened to inflate my heart. It slowed my steps when ambition urged me forward without regard for cost. It softened my speech when conviction tempted me toward severity, untempered by mercy. Above all, it taught me to lean upon Christ alone. My knowledge of the Scriptures, my experience, my endurance, even whatever reputation I had acquired, proved insufficient supports. They could steady me for a time, but they could not sustain me. In time, I ceased to fear the thorn and feared only forgetting its purpose. Each day it recalled me to the truth. The gospel I carried did not rise from my strength and did not rest upon it. Its course, from first breath to final word, was governed by grace. And in that knowledge I found a freedom no healing could have given. Chapter 17. The Shipwrecked Soul. Jerusalem, which had stirred in me memories both bitter and tender, felt colder on the day they seized me than any place of my travels. Their grip was harsh and unceremonious, but it was the familiarity in their faces that wounded me most. These were my own people, sons of Abraham, men whose prayers had once risen with mine, whose devotion to the law had shaped the very contours of my youth. In their voices, I heard echoes of convictions I had once shared without question. They shouted that I had defiled the temple, that I had abandoned Moses, that I had dared to draw Gentiles too near to the holy things of God. Beneath the noise of their accusations, however, lay something more intimate and more damning. What they despised was not what I had done, but what I had become. They dragged me toward the crowd in such haste that the matter might well have turned fatal had the Roman soldiers not intervened. Steel and discipline forced a passage where rage had all but completed its work. Blood was spared in that moment, but as I was pulled from their grasp, I understood that the sentence had already begun. Prison, chains, and in time, a journey to Rome itself, where Caesar would hear my case. Rome itself did not trouble me. Empires had long since surrendered their power to terrify me. My thoughts turned instead to the road ahead and what it might demand before I reached its end. When we set out, the sea presented itself in a posture of calm that invited false confidence. The winds were mild, the sky generous in its light. The vessel cut through the water, and for a time The voyage bore the appearance of an ordinary passage, unremarkable in every respect. But there are storms that begin long before they reveal themselves. My bones, wearied by years of labor and affliction, seemed to perceive what the eyes could not yet discern. The days lengthened. I fasted often. I prayed, at times with words formed in care, at times with no more than the turning of my thoughts toward God. I spoke to the sailors when they were willing to listen, and when they were not, I found myself addressing the waves. At times, the sea seemed a more attentive listener than the men who sailed upon it. The sky altered its expression. The wind, once companionable, grew restless. Then the storm declared itself. Sails tore like paper. Ropes snapped with sharp reports that cut through the roar of the wind. The hull groaned, its joints grinding against one another as the sea drove us onward. Men shouted in fear, and some wept. In the midst of that chaos, I found myself standing with a strange recognition of what would follow. "This ship will break," I told them, "but no life will be lost if you remain together." They looked at me as one might regard a man unmoored from reason. Whether from exhaustion or from a hope they dared not name, they remained. The ship broke, precisely as I had said. Driven upon the rocks of Malta, it splintered into fragments that scattered across the surf. We clung to whatever remnants we could grasp and struggled toward the shore, soaked, battered, and trembling. We crawled onto the land, cold and bruised, but alive. As I lay upon the coarse sand, watching the wreckage being claimed by the sea, I saw the shape of my life. What shattered often served a purpose I did not yet see. All my life I had labored to construct things that would not break. The law, as I once wielded it. The arguments of my youth, precise and unyielding. Even the assemblies I had helped to establish, which I had hoped might stand unshaken, were not spared fracture. Again and again, God chose to work in the breaking. I built ships. He calmed storms. And sometimes He allowed the storms to come. We remained on Malta for many months. The islanders received us with kindness. Fires were lit against the cold. Food was shared. Conversations unfolded without urgency. I found myself tending to the sick, speaking with those who sought guidance, and watching the slow turning of days. There, I was neither prisoner nor herald in any grand sense. I was a man, bearing salt in his beard and a peace in his heart that earlier victories had never granted me. By the time we resumed our journey and at last approached Rome, my legs were weaker and my breath more labored. The voyage had taken its toll upon my body, as such journeys always do. The fire within me still burned. The ship was gone, but the work to which I had been called remained. Chapter 18. The Second Chains. Rome, for all its reputation for severity and wickedness, did not receive me into the darkness of a dungeon. I was confined instead to a small chamber with a single window that admitted the dust, the noise, and the ceaseless movement of the city beyond. Through it, I could hear the rumble of carts upon stone, the shouts of merchants, the measured tramp of soldiers' feet. A guard stood at the door with spear in hand. I did not forget where I was. I was, by every legal measure, a prisoner, but I was free to write. So I wrote. The words came upon me with such urgency that they surprised even my weary spirit, a vessel long cracked by use, now giving way at last, and pouring out what it had held without restraint. These bore little resemblance to the sermons of restless assemblies or the warnings once proclaimed in crowded marketplaces, and they were far removed from the careful defenses prepared for counsels inclined toward judgment. They were letters shaped by affection. I wrote to Ephesus, whose struggles I knew as a man knows the scars upon his own body, wounds once grievous and now healed through patience and care. I wrote to Philippi, the city where I had once sung hymns in chains amid darkness and despair. Now, from confinement of another kind, I sent them words of joy. I wrote to Timothy, my child in the faith, whose courage I cherished as if he were my own son. I did not write with any expectation that these words might secure my release. I entertained no illusions regarding the probable outcome of my appeal. The trial would come, the sentence would be pronounced, the sword, when summoned, would not hesitate in the execution of its duty. But the word I bore was not bound to the continuance of my breath. That word would endure. I wrote to them of Christ, of unity among those tempted by faction and rivalry, of humility in a world intoxicated with its own cleverness, of peace that does not depend upon safety nor upon the favor of rulers. I spoke of a mystery that had once been hidden even from my own diligent eyes, now revealed with a clarity that astonished me still. That Jew and Gentile, once divided by suspicion and ordinance, were now joined together as one new man in him. I urged them to love when love was difficult, to live on when life seemed unreasonable, to rejoice when circumstances offered little encouragement. To Timothy, I wrote in particular insistence, aware that his path would demand courage of a quieter but no less costly sort. Preach the word, I urged him. Stand prepared at all times. Guard the message you have received and declare it in faith. Complete the work set before you. As the days passed, I grew increasingly conscious that my own season was drawing toward its close. The sensation carried no fear. Instead, there was a curious completeness to it, like the quiet awareness that settles at the end of a long day's labor, when the light fades and a man knows his hands have done all that was required of them. Outside my door, Rome continued its relentless performance. Chariots rattled across stone streets worn smooth by centuries of ambition. Soldiers marched with polished efficiency. Gold passed from hand to hand. Blood was spilled in arenas for the diversion of crowds who mistook cruelty for power. The empire displayed itself without rest, loud and confident, certain of its own permanence. Inside my small room, I dipped my pen once more into ink. They called me prisoner, but my words traveled farther than my feet had ever carried me, passing beyond walls and borders, beyond guards and judgments, running free where I could not go. Chapter 19. Poured Out. There is, in the final hours of a long labor, a peculiar stillness that settles upon the soul before the last act is performed. I feel that stillness now, with a clarity that admits of no confusion. The air itself seems to have grown quieter, and the world beyond my small chamber has begun, without any conscious signal, to withdraw its claims upon me. The guard who passes my door now moves at a slower pace than before. He no longer studies me through the practiced suspicion reserved for men who might attempt escape or defiance. There is a subdued acknowledgment in his glance. I will soon trouble his watch no further. He says little. He need not. Time has taken over the conversation. I do not fear what lies ahead. Death, which once appeared to me as an impenetrable wall, now seems a thin veil, lightly drawn, through which the brightness beyond may already be glimpsed. I have, in a sense, stood at its edge before, on that road where my life was first undone and remade by a voice I had never expected and could never claim as my due. My thoughts return often to Damascus, to the dust beneath my feet, to the sudden stillness of the world, to the voice that spoke my name. It astonishes me, even now, how much of my life began in blindness, and how I see as its end approaches. I consider what I have lost along the way, the familiarity of home, with its rhythms once taken for granted, the ease of friendships formed in youth, untested by disagreement or danger, the respect of my own people, which I once prized as a mark of righteousness. These things have passed from me like leaves carried off by a persistent wind, leaving the branches bare. What I have gained resists any simple accounting. I have known the risen Christ as one knows a presence that cannot be reduced to debate. He has met me in light and in silence, in chains and at the table. I have walked unfamiliar roads, entered cities whose tongues were foreign to me, and taken the hands of strangers who, in time and by grace, became my family. I have heard the name of Jesus whispered in tongues foreign to my ears, and still understood in my spirit with an intimacy that required no translation. I have seen fear give way to hope, and despair loosen its grip in places where I once believed only darkness could dwell. I have watched the church come into being. It unfolded through error and conflict, through confusion and pain. Still, it lived. It advanced with a vitality no council decree and no sword could silence. Now, I sense that my own part in this story draws toward its close. With a hand made less steady by years of labor, travel, and injury, I write once more, setting down words that feel like a quiet acknowledgement of what has already been accomplished. I am already being poured out like a drink offering, and the time of my departure is at hand. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. This body, bent and marked by the passage of years, has completed the work assigned to it. I bear it no resentment for its weariness. It has served faithfully, carrying me farther than I ever deserved to go. I do not know the precise manner by which my life will be taken from me, though I suspect it will be by the sword, swift and efficient in the Roman fashion. Such particulars no longer trouble me. They belong to the mechanics of a world I am already leaving behind. For I know who waits beyond that final moment. The man who once held the cloaks while another was stoned, who breathed threats and sought blood in the name of righteousness, will not stand there. Only Paul, only grace, only Christ. Chapter 20. I have kept the faith. There comes, at the end of a long confession, a stillness that settles upon a man like evening upon a field after harvest. The labor is finished. The words have been spent. Nothing presses forward, demanding utterance. I dwell within that stillness now, When my case was concluded and the sentence fixed, the chamber in which I had written so many letters was taken from me. Iron was fastened upon my wrists. The familiar light of the window was removed. I was led down stone steps worn by many feet before mine, into a place where the air held no memory of sun. Here the walls sweat with damp, and sound does not travel far. A narrow opening, high above, permits a thin thread of day, sufficient only to mark the passing of hours. The darkness here is complete. It does not trouble me. I have known a deeper blindness. The letters are finished. My hand has grown unsteady. Ink and parchment are no longer granted. I write now in memory alone. Stephen stands before me, his face lifted in forgiveness while stones fell without mercy. Ananias bends toward me with hands that restored sight to eyes opened before they were prepared. Barnabas receives me when others feared to draw near. Timothy listens with the attention of a son who understands that time is brief. Lydia opens her home without hesitation. Silas sings when iron closes around his limbs. The jailer in Philippi washes blood from my back and discovers grace in the same hour. The sea rises again in recollection. Timber splinters. Men cling to wreckage. Malta receives us with fire and shelter. A serpent strikes and falls away harmless. Through storm, through hunger, through accusation, through chains, the presence of God remains constant. Above all, I return to that road, the light, the voice. My name spoken with authority and compassion joined in one command. That moment divided my life. Saul fell there. Paul rose. This dungeon completes the path upon which I was set long ago. The empire believes it confines me. It confines only my body. The word entrusted to me has already traveled beyond these walls. It will move through cities I never saw, among peoples whose language I never learned. I sense the nearness of my departure, like the steadiness of a tide that keeps its appointed hour. The sword will perform its office. Flesh will yield. Breath will cease. None of this unsettles me. The life I once guarded devotedly was surrendered on the road to Damascus. What remains has been gift. I have poured it out as fully as I was permitted. The mission entrusted to me has carried me across stony roads and prison floors, over restless seas and into halls of judgment. It has led me through praise and through accusation, through fellowship and through chains. And now it draws to its close. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the course. I have kept the faith. Soon these stones will release me. By the mercy that claimed me long before Rome pronounced its verdict. They may say that I died in this city. They will be mistaken. I go to behold the one who called me, who corrected me, who sustained me when strength failed, and who kept me when I could not keep myself. The veil grows thin. I step through.